So, we have to be aware of several different types of figures of speech. First is the metaphor. The metaphor is a comparison. And so it's applying a word or a phrase to something it doesn't apply to literally, in order to make a comparison with the literal usage. So when Jesus says, I'm the good shepherd, or I am the gate for the sheep, in John chapter 10, he's a metaphor, right? Jesus as the gate for the sheep isn't actually this high and made of wood. Right? You know, the idea is that he is the way. And so just as a gate works for a sheepfold, Jesus works for salvation. And so that idea is comparison. Another type of comparison is the simile. And of course, the simile is a comparison using like or as. Right? So saying something is as red as a rose, for example. In 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 25, Peter says, for you were going astray like sheep. Right? And so this idea of comparison, but using like or as. This can be a very important point. Let's look at Luke chapter 23, I believe. No, 22. Luke chapter 22. And verse 44. Luke 22 and verse 44. Now, I have heard this passage, and I've seen people attempt to explain this passage by saying that there is a medical condition where someone can actually bleed, blood can come through the pores of a person. And that this is under times of great stress. The blood can actually come out your pores. And so it's like you're sweating blood. And so Luke 22 verse 44, and being in agony, this is Jesus at Gethsemane, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. So people have tried to explain this passage by talking about this medical condition, to try and explain how Jesus could sweat blood. The problem is Luke doesn't say he sweat blood. And so somebody missed that tiny little word, like. His sweat was like drops of blood. Have you ever seen a head wound? Blood just pours. I mean, head wounds, some head wounds, it can be, it doesn't have to be serious, but you get the tiniest little cut sometimes and it just pours out of you. So what's Luke saying? Luke's saying Jesus was sweating so profusely, it was just like blood just pouring off of his head. But what we do sometimes as Christians, we try to explain things we don't have to explain. And so people, oh yeah, this medical condition, that's not what Luke's talking about. He's talking about a comparison. It's a simile. And so pay attention to language. Language matters. Third type of figure of speech important to watch out for is hyperbole. Right? I've told you a million times. Well, usually it's a parent that says that. I've told you a million times. And has your parent actually told you a million times? No. But when I say I told you a million times, what am I saying? Yeah, right? I've told you a lot of times, right? And I'm trying to say, to get it across how many times I've told you this, I'm just using this huge number. Now, we recognize, even if we don't realize it, we recognize hyperbole when it comes to the biblical text. I'll give you a perfect example. Everybody go like this. All right? If you're watching, you don't have the video, stick your hands out in front of you. You say, okay, what's that? Let's turn to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5. And this will prove you believe in hyperbole. Verse 30. Matthew chapter 5. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. And we are a bunch of very holy Christians, and our right hand has never caused us any problems. We've never taken something we shouldn't. We've never done anything. We've never hit anybody.
One day you're going to say that on the back.
I'm not going to say that. I've looked through that the audience before I make that comment. But we automatically assume this doesn't literally mean that. We don't literally pluck out our eye when we look at things we shouldn't look at. One, we think Jesus is speaking hyperbolically. The problem is when we try to help Jesus along, right? And try to make sure Jesus doesn't make any mistakes. Matthew chapter 19, verse 24. Right? The context is the rich young ruler. Jesus has just told the rich young ruler to sell all his possessions and give to the poor, and the rich young ruler has gone away very sorrowful. And Jesus turns to the disciples and says, verse 23, "Truly I say to you, only with difficulty will a rich person enter the kingdom of heaven. Again I tell you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God." And we'll say, oh, well, what Jesus is referring to, and maybe you've heard this. I've actually heard this, right? So I'm not making things up. I've heard people say it. That there was a gate in Jerusalem known as the Needle Gate. And I've seen people shake their heads, so some of you have heard this, right? And so the camels had to get down really, really low in order to get through the Needle Gate. And so it was very, very difficult for that camel to go through that Needle Gate. Now, that sounds very good. Except there wasn't a needle gate in Jerusalem until 1,000 years after when Jesus said this. There was no needle gate in Jerusalem at the time Jesus said this. So guess what? He is not talking about a camel trying to go through the needle gate. He's talking about a camel going through the eye of a sewing needle. And so people are trying to prevent Jesus from sounding odd or strange or saying something about rich people. But what he's saying is what he is saying, right? And that's hyperbolic. Can rich people be saved? Absolutely. But it's very, very difficult. It's the point that Jesus is trying to make. It's not about some camel, it's not about this thing that people invented that is historically inaccurate. There is the metonymy, where one word is used for another. So, for example, today, when people talk about Hollywood or Washington, things that go on in Hollywood. Well, Hollywood puts out horrible movies, or things are terrible in Washington. It's not those cities, it's the movie producers and actors, it's the Congress people, and so we use Hollywood to talk about something else. We use Washington to talk about something else. Same kind of thing. In Matthew chapter 23, verse 37, Jesus says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets." Right? Was the city of Jerusalem actually killing prophets? No, a city can't kill prophets. But he's using metonymy. He's using one word in place of another. Right? It's the people of Jerusalem. Another type of figure of speech that's important to recognize is the synecdoche. This is when it's this figure of speech in which a part is used for the whole, or vice versa, whole is used for the part. So, for example, if I'm talking about an orchestra, and I say, well, yeah, the orchestra has 50 strings. What I mean is the orchestra has 50 stringed instruments, each of which has more than one string. Right? So the total number of strings in a symphony is more than that. But I'm using the string to refer to the instrument. Likewise, if I say the United States beat Russia in hockey, I don't mean everybody in the United States played everybody in Russia and we won. I mean that the team from the United States beat the team from Russia. Right? But I say the United States beat Russia in hockey. I'm using the whole for simply a part. Right? So, for example, when it says the Word became flesh, right? Jesus had more than skin. Right? He had bones, he had ligaments, right? He had organs. Sometimes this becomes a difficulty because there are places in Acts where it will say, like, a great number of the priests believed. But it's more than just believe. Right? It wasn't just they believed, they also changed their life, they were also baptized, right? All those kinds of things. But instead of saying, every time Luke talks about somebody becoming a follower of Jesus, he doesn't have to say, well, okay, they heard the word, and then they believed, and then they changed their lives, and then they confessed Jesus as their Lord, and then they were baptized, and then they tried to live a faithful life. Belief is a synecdoche, right? A word used for the whole. Another type of word, we talked a little bit about this, the idiom. The idiom where the phrase has to be taken as a whole. Because if you try to stick the parts together, it doesn't work. So, for example, he had a change of heart, or he changed his mind. To talk about those things, if you would take the pieces apart, right, you would, and then put them together, you would come up with something different, right? And so he changed his heart, right? And so they cracked open his chest, they disconnected his heart, took that one out, put another heart in, right? Well, what do we mean? Well, he decided to be different, decided to be more compassionate. And he picked the bucket and pulled someone's leg, right? We have all these idioms that we use. Well, the Bible has idioms too, and so we have to be careful that we don't look at something literally that isn't meant to be understood literally. So, for example, we use Genesis chapter 4. Adam knew his wife. Right? It's an idiom for they had sexual relations. And so those idioms, we have to be careful that we don't misunderstand the idiom, because if the case of the foreigner in a different country saying something outlandish because they don't understand the idiom, or misunderstanding something because it's an idiom. So the same kind of thing has to be a part of our understanding of biblical text. We also have to be aware of the fact that there are different genres in the Bible. And this is all part of issues related to language. The Bible represents a compendium of different styles of literature. And you approach different styles of literature differently. So what types of literature are in the Bible? What are some of the different types? All right, so there's some that are poetic in nature. Do you interpret a poem the same way as you might interpret a list of laws, for example? Right, you approach it differently, right? And so when we approach poetic language, we should be very careful to interpret those things in certain ways. What are some other types of genres in Scripture? Right, historical narrative. Right, and so the same kind of thing, right? You approach narrative different than you would approach poem. What else? Biographies, right? A lot of those connected with narrative, right? So you have narratives that are kind of just general narratives. Gospels kind of fit in there with biography or biographical parts. What else?
Revelation.
All right, the book of Revelation, which is kind of it's prophecy. This is we might call a subgenre, apocalyptic prophecy, which would include Ezekiel and Daniel. But prophecy. What else? Okay, so we have some Song of Solomon, right? And that's one that I've studied. I've not studied. I've read through, reading through the Bible. I don't completely understand, because there's a lot of language that's used in that if you said to your wife or to your spouse that your neck is like a tower of Gilead, that's not really going to move somebody too much. But that's the kind of language, the romantic language that's used in that. But there's also some things in there that I think fall into those euphemisms, right? Where the beloved is saying some things that, if we translated them literally or said literally what they're saying, would be very racist. So there's romance, law. would be another one that would be in there as well. Right? So we have all these different narratives, and we approach them differently. And then also, we might say wisdom literature, like Proverbs or Ecclesiastes. We have to be careful with wisdom literature as well, because if we interpret it literally like law, we could find ourselves in a very difficult position. A lot of parents have racked themselves with guilt because of Proverbs 22:6, train up children in the way they should go, and when they're old they will not depart from it. And so when their children fall away from the church, they look at that passage and they're racked with guilt. We must have done something wrong. But that's not what that necessarily literally means. Because when you come to Proverbs, right, Proverbs are in general, if you point the child in the way they should go, they're going to go that way. But it's not a hard and fast guarantee. A penny saved is not always a penny earned. I mean, and there's a difference between that kind of parable or proverb and the biblical proverbs. But it's important to recognize that you interpret wisdom literature differently. It's generally the case if you train up a child, but it doesn't mean it's always going to be the case. Why? Because children have free will, and so we have to be careful, especially. I mean, as we minister to people, that's probably going to come up at some point, is that issue. A parent just racked with guilt because their child has fallen away and they feel like there's something they could have done. Now, maybe they could have, but it doesn't mean that they necessarily failed. Their children could have made their own decisions. We'll go ahead and stop right there. We'll pick up with some other things related to exegesis and theology when we get together on